All right, here's the scenario. Mom gets news that son's died. Local reporter calls mom and says, Mom, what do you have to say? Mom says, my son was a hero. Reporter faithfully, of course, writes that down and publishes it out there. Justice Alito says, does that make Mom a public figure? I said, I don't know. You haven't drawn that line that brightly. But here's what I do know. Now that Mom and reporter put their heads together and said that in the public airwaves, if I write a letter to the editor saying I think this war is wrong, and I don't think he is a hero, and it gets published, you don't get to sue me, Mom. That's what I know for sure, unless we don't mean one word that we said for 150 years about the most important thing to protect is public debate. These soldiers and their families are not private figures, and these are not private events. You show me a private funeral, and you will not see me there. And I have never gone to a soldier's funeral.
Just a quick point, because those are actually not the facts of the case. Mr. Snyder, that's the facts argued on one side, and the facts argued on other side, obviously. But since we're here in a forum where maybe people want to know, the actual facts as found by this trier fact. Basically, Mr. Snyder put an obituary out on his son. Local reporters, as they always do with military deaths, we've seen it in Michigan, did a very brief interview with him. Until after the funeral, after he learned of the Phelps protest, he was not at all very much involved in the public airwaves, and there is a long-standing First Amendment doctrine that even the Fourth Circuit recognized, that says that if somebody brings you into the public spotlight, they can then not argue that you are a public figure for purposes of any claim against them, because they themselves thrust you into the public spotlight. And second of all, this public-private figure distinction also goes against a long line of precedent, which has held that truly private funerals at religious sites and other similar sites have been held repeatedly by courts for a variety of purposes, not just First Amendment purposes, to be private events. Now, I would agree that the situation you mentioned in Oklahoma with the governors, that's a different matter. But these have repeatedly been held to be private events. And again, I just think it's essential to make sure that people are aware of both sides of this argument. I personally think Mr. Snyder has a pretty good chance of losing on a number of these issues. But I do want to point out that the epic was targeted at Mr. Snyder, at his personal life, and at his son, indirectly. This was not your normal writing a letter to the editor after saying, I protest the war. This was that, he taught his son adultery and taught his son, there's no evidence of, any of this stuff. It was very much targeted at Mr. Snyder.
Well, he sued for defamation, and that got thrown out and not appealed. And, now let's really be factual. 3 lengthy interviews with 5 media outlets in his home, 3 days after the boy died, several days before the funeral. Where do you think we got all that information to put in that epic about the divorce, about the housemaid, about raising him in the Catholic Church, about teaching him to celebrate Christmas? He went to the public airwaves on the occasion of the son's death. It might be helpful for you to go review the exhibits in the trial. The obituary had nothing to do with it. This gentleman.
Can I ask a follow-up question to this quickly that's right on the subject? Before the church was picketing military funerals, they had been picketing the funerals of gay people, and this was frequent.
Not frequent, but it had happened.
It had happened. Okay. Would you attempt to picket it, Matthew Shepard's funeral side, okay? Would you attempt to picket the funeral of a non-soldier now like you did before when you picketed the funerals of gay people? Or given the scrutiny this issue has been given, would you be worried that you would not be protected by the First Amendment because the gay person or their family are not public figures and there's not an obvious public issue involved?
Well, the short answer is no, and I don't know what issue could be more public. If you had to rank order them, the single most important public issue in this nation is the dying soldiers, closely related, and the second single most important issue is the issue of homosexuality. and how this country's going to deal with it. One of the justices asked about making a racial comment. Third most important issue, racial issues. I don't understand how you could say that homosexuality. Now, here's how we decide where to go. Maybe that's what you're trying to get at.
Okay.
You make it public, we'll make it public. I mean, the Matthew Shepard thing, once again, we sat back at Topeka watching the international media lining up to come, not just to come and say, that's sad, so sad. It wouldn't have come for that. They came to say, lionize that way of life.
But you have also
That is a
picketed,
good way of life. We're going to turn this funeral into a referendum on the question of homosexuality. You take a funeral of anybody and you turn it into a public discussion about a moral issue impacting this nation, you have now created a public platform, and no, we're not going to go to the funeral. We will never go to the funeral. We will never get physically close to the funeral. But by golly, we are going to speak up about that funeral and get in a respectful legal proximity and speak while the rest of you are speaking. Everybody says to us, why the issue of homosexuality? Why do you focus on that? Because you focus on that. You start having a divorced and remarried pride parade and we'll be there. But when you make it the issue, you make it the public go-to, we're publishers.
But didn't you just concede the point in the Snyder case? Because he never brought any of these issues.
He brought all these issues
He
up.
never brought a moral issue up. He never
Sure
brought,
he did, divorce.
He did
Sure
not.
he did,
He did
divorce.
not bring those
Should
issues
we be in a
up.
war, he brought it up.
He never
You
brought
haven't
up.
read the article, sir, you don't know.
I did
where-
read the article,
He
and
brought up whether we
he
should
did
be in a
not-
war,
he
he brought
did
up his
not-
divorce, he brought up whether the kids should be raised in the Catholic Church. Of course he brought the
He did
war
not.
issue.
He did
Professor
not.
Ravitch, Keely, I think, wanted to make a comment here. Let's hear what she has to say, please.
I have several points. One, you've just admitted that you have in the past gone to gay funerals other than Matthew Shepard that were not public.
No, I didn't
And
admit
just
that, I
because-
said if they were public,
That's
I'd
my
be there.
turn. Just because it's an important issue does not make it a public event. A funeral is still a private event, whether it's gay, military, whomever. And publishing an obituary does not make it a public event. I published an obituary when my grandmother died, but that didn't make her Lindsay Lohan. And I published things in there that she had been divorced and her ex-husband. I'm not putting those in issues, they're simply facts relating to this person's life and inviting people, friends and family, to attend a very private memorial so
Why
that
don't
we
you
can.
publish it?
That's the distinction, though.
Why
That's
do you
key in the
publish it?
Snyder case, because there's a big difference between a funeral that has become a matter of public discussion, which is true in the Matthew Shepard case, it had, and a private funeral where a 10-second or 20-second piece is on the air, as with For All Soldiers, and an obituary is published. The fact that someone talks about the facts of their life in a context where someone just died, which of course always happens, not only in obituaries, but if there's public interest stories for somebody who died that maybe was a donor or whatever, you know, that's different than the funeral itself being the moral issue that you are basing this right on. The Matthew Shepard situation is very different from the Snyder
Well, the
situation.
Snyder situation is closer to the Shepherd, and there's more than an obituary, but you need to go read what the sociologists say about the fact that this has become a nation of public mourners, and study the history of how we got from the type of funeral that we used to have 200 years ago and the public mourning that we have today, and why do you publish an obituary with all the details and the time and the location, except that it's because you want people to come. So in point of fact, the culture of this nation is that your funerals and your mourning have become public. Now, it's on a spectrum, some more than others. We go to the more. But the fact is, obituaries do turn it into a public event, and there's even case law on the fact that once you publish in the obituary, you have created a public open event in some measures. Now, we don't go there, we don't press that point, but now that you are, I'm not going to let it stand. But it's far above and beyond. When we come pulling up 1,000 feet away out of sight and out of sound, and there's about 50 members of the media out there, waiting to film as they come and go, talk to family members as they come and go, and 700 or 800, and now lately, the ones I've done in the last 2 or 3 months, it's 1,600 and 1,800 and 2,000. It's in McAllister, Oklahoma, population 20,000, 2,000 people out there. I'm 5 blocks away with 2,000 people between 6 of us, 2,000 of them. Don't pretend like these funerals are not public events, and that this debate going on out on the public sidewalk about how God is dealing with this nation through its dying soldiers has anything to do with some private, dignified, old school kind of a funeral. It's just, it belies the facts on the ground. And you keep arguing it, and then we'll just have to see where it goes.
Well, first of all,
While we're out there.
Professor Ravitch, let's just see if we have another questions in the crowd here, please. Let's go back here. Thank you. Right here. Yeah, woman in gray, curly hair. Before you ask the question, I just want to remind the panel, let's not try to interrupt each other, let a person finish before you speak. Thank you.
My question is also for Ms. Phelps. What I've been noticing, just as you've been speaking, is that you seem to, this is just kind of a lawyerly question, this isn't really a scandalous question, you seem to sort of mesh your legal arguments, both with your personal beliefs and with your religious arguments, and I'm just sort of wondering, just as a law student who is also a Christian blogger, conservative, get very passionate about things, even I have trouble sometimes separating my legal arguments from my passion. How in the world did you manage to stand in front of the Supreme Court and separate your legal arguments from your personal arguments? Because I've noticed they're sort of meshing together, and I do know at one point Justice Scalia looked at you and said, "Oh my goodness."
Justice Scalia is an interesting character.
I'm sorry.
It's a good question, and Terry Moran from Nightline asked me that as I stood at a picket at Arlington National Cemetery the day before the argument. But it's a simple answer. It's just be professional. It's this forum, as you can see by this array of panelists, and by the array of issues that have come up in the discussion and in the questions, is a forum where there is some blending of it. When I'm out on the streets, it's not really the time to talk about the legal rights unless I'm dealing with law enforcement. When I stood in front of SCOTUS, which by the way does come up sometimes, when I stood in front of the SCOTUS, I understood what the job there was. I'm a senior, I have another professional life where I'm a senior manager supervising dozens of people in a large state agency. You know, it's a matter of you understand what your job is at the moment and you just be professional. I also I was raised, I cut my teeth on separation of church and state. So when I'm on the government platform doing a job that I'm being paid to do, I don't speak a thing about my religious beliefs. And our children who go to public schools, we will not participate in any event in that school that pertains to any of these holidays or all these national celebrations that we do. I think there's just, it's a time and place and proper decorum issue, I think. You just handle it.
The other question? Yes, sir. Right here in the middle.
So I guess I'll pose this question to both Professor Ravitch and Ms. Phelps. I guess the issue turns on whether or not it's public or private, so what's the threshold for private?
Well, there's a test. There's a test. And in fact, way back when they were trying to grapple with what to do about, under the tort of defamation, how to tell between private issues and public issues and private figures and public officials, early on they were unwilling to go down that trail of case by case, determining is this a public issue. But then with the passage of time, they grappled with it. And there's a test, and it's called time, context, content, what's my third word? It's the green moss. Content, form, and context. Content, form, and context. And we talked about that a lot at the Fourth Circuit. Content, form, and context. Ask yourself under those three headings, what's really going on with this debate.
And I'll add the law that she's speaking about is absolutely applicable in defamation cases. But there is a case, the Jerry Falwell Hustler case and a related case that actually limit that sort of analysis to defamation cases. Now, the Fourth Circuit disagreed with that. The Fourth Circuit held that this applies across the torts. That would seem to be in conflict with the holdings in the case. Again, I read the briefs. I mean, We may disagree on things, but Ms. Phelps did an exceptionally good job arguing that, and I felt that there were other arguments that could have been made to explain better why, you know, on the other side, why the Hustler case does not apply to IIED and torts like that. So I will say that that test is absolutely applicable to defamation, but many courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court in the Hustler case, and lower courts have recognized this repeatedly, that because torts like intentional infliction of emotional distress are generally based on things aimed at someone at a particularly touchy time or under particularly questionable circumstances that would give rise to IIED or workplace harassment, that sort of a thing, that the defamation test that was just mentioned doesn't necessarily apply in these cases. So, and that is a debate that's before, by the way, on cert now to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court may finally answer that question, whether Hustler meant what it said when it said this is limited to defamation, or whether that was dicta and really it might apply to other torts. You know, the U.S. Supreme Court will answer that question hopefully in this case, so we'll know.
And the important thing to keep in mind when you do that analysis is two things about IIED. Defamation, false speech, is low-value speech, not true speech. It's a matter of law. The speech in Snyder is true speech. They filed on defamation, they lost, and they didn't appeal it. So you're talking true speech. And second, IIED is almost always going after non-speech behavior. So if I got up in someone's face and was screaming and yelling and shoving them and threatening them, well, yeah, I'm engaged in speech, but of course I shouldn't be doing that. And you would never see us doing that. But when you start taking speech and trying to put it under IIED, and true speech at that, which is what you had in Falwell also, because they also lost their defamation claim, then it's not time to lower the bar, it's time to raise the bar. So whatever they're going to do with content, form, and context in that setting, it must be more protective of that high-value speech.
But I will say the IIED aspect to it, there have been many IIED cases where truthful speech has given rise to damages for IIED. So that's one of the questions that really needs to be answered, whether or not that should be the case. But certainly right now, as it stands, truthful speech can give rise to damages for IIED. Part of the question is context, and in fact, that's one of the fundamental reasons the Hustler Court would not apply the defamation test to IIED, because of the fact that truthfulness itself isn't really, it's absolutely core to defamation claims, but it's not necessarily relevant to IIED claims. Now again, all of that may change after this case, but as of now, the law would suggest that the truthfulness of the speech is irrelevant, and that's why the defamation, to IIED claims, and that's why the defamation test would not apply in the IIED context. Whether it stays that way, we'll see, and I don't know, when do you think it's going to come out?
We have time for just...
Never speech alone, never speech alone. Speech plus misconduct, that's what it applies.
We have time for another question. Let's go. Yes, you sir, right here.
This is directed to everyone on the panel, anyone who'd like to answer this. And I understand, I believe in the Snyder brief, the issue was brought up about balancing speech rights in the First Amendment versus religion. And I'm interested to see how that works out and what you have to say about that. For example, a funeral, in many of these cases at least, the funeral is held at a church, and it's clearly a religious event. And whether you would contrast that with, or how you would contrast that with, say, a public event in which people gather in a park that announce on some Facebook, on Facebook that they want to gather in this park to honor same dead soldier. So I want all panelists to talk about balancing those.
Well, it's simple, for my answer, simple, as we wrote in our brief. I'll give you that it's a religious event, although at least half of them that we've had anything to do with were not in a church. But I'll give you that for the sake of the discussion. And so I shouldn't go interrupt it, and I won't go interrupt it. Now I expect that to be reciprocated. And we're having our religious event out there. We expect it not to be. It's simple for me. You don't need to balance something unless you're actually interfering. You don't interfere with anything, never interfered with anything. We'll never run through anything. We haven't stopped one piece of the funeral ever, one piece of the procession ever, one piece of the burial ever, and we never will. So thankfully, we don't have to reach that balancing question in our case.
And actually, this may be a shock, and I completely agree with that. There is no, I was the weakest argument. It was the, don't put that in the document, I'm just kidding. It's the weakest argument in the petitioner's brief, and the reason for that is that under the facts of this case, there is absolutely, I mean, as a law and religion person, free exercise is core, fundamental to our society and our freedoms. It's one of the most important things possible. I was as a law and religion person, may say even more than speech, but I get killed for that. So, but the bottom line, not by you, but by everyone. But the bottom line is that there was no evidence in this case that the actual religious ceremony itself was disrupted, which is what it would take to even get to the balancing question. That's separate from the tort questions as to how the conduct affected Mr. Snyder separately, but there was nothing to balance here. I could envision a case where that could happen, which would be where that maybe there's an outdoor burial and somehow the protesters are being heard during the burial, but in this case the Snyders left, the Phelpses left before the actual the religious ceremony started. So there's really nothing to balance there. I don't really see the point to that argument. I thought that petitioners had many stronger arguments, and as Learned had said, usually it's better to keep to your strong ones, and because the more you see, the less convincing they all seem. So.
Jay, would you like to add to that at all?
I kind of concur.